Thank you, Tony. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening on behalf of the U.S. Commercial Service in coordination with the District Export Councils of New Jersey, San Diego, and Connecticut. We welcome all of you to the 10-part compliance series during the World Trade Month. My name is Brian Beams. I am your host for today's session. With us is the producer of the series, Mr. Tony Sargis. We do have a couple events left or sessions left for Thursday, and then next week, Ask a Professional. Remember, folks, Ask a Professional is pretty neat. We also will have a special agent present before that, explaining and presenting, I guess, everything when it relates to export enforcement. Good people to know, and good people to know early in your exporting career. Then a couple housekeeping before we introduce our subject matter expert. Everyone is currently on listen-only mode. This session will be recorded. If you object, please disconnect at this time. Participants, you can write in a question at any time during the presentation into the Q&A feature. We will have a Q&A component at the end of this session, so don't worry about that. And then, of course, echoing it, we'd like you to attend next week, our next week's session, Ask a Professional. And then we'll also be emailing probably Monday morning these 2 weeks, this week, the two sessions. And then also the first week of June, we'll email all the presentations, the resource materials, so on and so forth for this entire 10-part series to you, the registrant. Lastly, the views and opinions expressed in today's presentation may not reflect the official policy and or position of the U.S. government. Let's welcome in Tahlia Townsend, partner at Wiggin and Dana. Welcome, Tahlia. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's my pleasure to be here. Hello, everybody. Thank you for making time to join us today. It's my pleasure to provide this presentation and some information on export controls at trade shows. As Brian said, I'm a partner at the law firm of Wiggin and Dana. I'm actually the chair of the International Trade Compliance Group at Wiggin and Dana, and it's my pleasure to be the attorney on these matters for many, many large US companies, many large international companies, and also a lot of startups and smaller companies. So I'm familiar with how this appears to US companies and foreign companies, and I probably know a number of you who are attending today. So please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to get to them. So with that, let's talk about export controls at trade shows. I know many of you already have a great deal of experience. Some of you are newer. I will try to cover the matter in a way that is helpful for those of you who are less familiar with the principles, but also hopefully for those of you who have a little more experience. So let's think first about how exports happen at trade shows. Before we do that, we should talk briefly just to make sure everybody's on the same page about what is an export or a re-export or an in-country transfer or a retransfer if you're talking ITAR speak. So the most obvious kind is an actual shipment or transmission out of the United States. That would be an export. Or if it's happening from one foreign country to another of something that was originally exported from the US, ended up in Germany, and now it's going from Germany to France or Brazil or something, that would be a re-export. And both of those would be regulated activities if the item is subject to US export controls. In addition, we can have exports of information and of source code. And those can happen when you provide that information or source code to a foreign person, a person who is not a United States person. That could happen in the United States if you're talking to somebody who's here on a visa. It could happen outside the United States if people are of different nationalities talking to each other, exchanging information subject to US export controls. It could also happen by visual disclosure. It doesn't have to be verbal. If a foreign person has access to see a piece of controlled hardware, it's possible that looking at the controlled hardware will reveal technical information necessary for the design or development, production, manufacture, operation, use, maintenance, repair, something, assembly of the item. And if it does, then that visual access will also be considered an export or re-export. Indeed, if you have information that is controlled and you keep it in a filing cabinet, or you keep it on an internet system, you keep it on an electronic system, and you give somebody the means to access that electronic system, that is also considered an export of the information that they will be able to access with the key to the door, the key to the filing cabinet, the electronic key, the encryption key, whatever type of access information you're giving them. There are some other things that are considered exports that are less, come up less often, but just to make sure we think about them: transferring registration, control or ownership of certain EAR controlled spacecraft. Even if they never leave the United States, as soon as you give a foreign person control or ownership, that is considered an export. And same thing for any ITAR controlled aircraft, vessel or satellite. There are also defense services to worry about: US persons who are providing assistance to foreign persons in the design, development, production, repair, operation, use, etc. of items described on the US munitions list, which we also refer to as defense articles or ITAR controlled articles. That is also a type of export. It's called a defense service, and it's a regulated activity. And then changes of end user and end use are also regulated. So if something is exported for a particular party, for them to be the end user, and then it is changed to another party, that is also a regulated activity, and the same thing for end use. So those are the basic concepts. Let's think now about how those concepts can affect activities, particularly at trade shows. When I think about trade shows, and in my experience helping clients with government investigations arising out of trade shows and export violations arising out of trade shows, there are intended exports, things that you plan to do at the trade show that end up causing an export or re-export to occur. And then there are some unintended or incidental exports. You're not really thinking of them as an intended activity for the trade show, but they happen in connection with the trade show, and they also can give rise to exports and re-exports. So we have to keep track of both the activities that you're going to perform at the trade show and how they give rise to exports, and other things that will necessarily happen or very frequently happen when someone travels to a trade show, but that might not be immediately on your radar screen as things that can cause exports. So for the intended activities, usually when you're traveling to a trade show, you take something with you to demonstrate at the trade show, to show the potential customers your wares. And very often that's going to be a piece of hardware, perhaps the product that the company produces. So when you take that piece of hardware out of the United States to a trade show in a foreign country, that piece of hardware is being exported. And we have to make sure that there is authorization for that export. Typically, when you travel, you don't just take the hardware, but you take a lot of marketing information. There could be product brochures, there could be flyers, posters to put on the booth, photographs, maybe you want to show a video. All of those types of information could potentially contain technical information that is subject to control by the US government. And so we have to think about whether any of that information will give rise to a controlled export when it's taken to the trade show, or when it is distributed to the participants at the trade show. So there's a two-step process. First, you take it from the United States to the place where the trade show is occurring, and then you might distribute that information. And when you distribute it, you'll be distributing it to the participants at that trade show, and that will also be an export activity or a re-export activity. While you're at the trade show, you're going to display the hardware, you're going to distribute the brochures. You're also going to, in many cases, conduct product demonstrations, show the potential customers how your product works, why they should want to buy it, answer some questions perhaps from the participants of the trade show. In each of those circumstances, exports and re-exports can occur. Because you will be sharing information that is related to the piece of hardware that's being demonstrated, showing participants how to use it, showing them what it can do. That may convey information that is subject to control. And if so, then that is an export or a re-export activity. And then there's some activities that may occur kind of on the side of the trade show. If you get lucky and there are customers who are potential customers interested in buying the product, they may want to have a little follow-up conversation. Perhaps you take them aside, perhaps you schedule a follow-up meeting with them, and your salespeople have a more detailed discussion with them. Well, exports of technical information can occur in the course of those meetings as well. That's the kind of activities you're planning to do when you go to a trade show, and the way that they give rise to exports and re-exports. But when we travel to trade shows, sometimes incidental or unintended exports also occur. If you think about it, usually these days when we travel with electronic devices. And typically our electronic devices contain documents that relate to our work. They may contain contracts with attachments that are technical in nature. We may receive emails. We may have emails saved on our devices, or we may receive emails while we're traveling. And we may log in to electronic systems for our workplace while we're overseas at the trade show, trying to do a little work on the side, as well as dealing with the trade show activity. In all of those cases, there's a possibility that you will be exporting regulated information. If your laptop contains ITAR or EAR controlled information, and you take it with you to a trade show, or the salesperson takes it with them to the trade show, then the laptop is being exported, the cell phone is being exported, but so is all the information on it. And if any of that information requires authorization for the country where the trade show is occurring, that's also an export and has to be authorized. Similarly, if you are receiving emails while you're overseas, and those emails have technical controlled information in them, then that information is being exported to the country where the trade show is occurring and where you're receiving the email. So we have to think carefully about the authorization that exists to receive the technical information, controlled information in that country. One other way things can go wrong is when we're trying to get our work done while we're at the trade show, and we may be sitting in the hotel trying to deal with the emails, respond to inquiries, etc. Well, if you're sitting there and you're attached to a public Wi-Fi, who knows who might be able to access your information, but also people walking by may be able to see the screen of the laptop, and their visual access, if they're not a US person, which is likely if you're in a foreign country, would also be an export. So all of these things have to be considered before anybody goes to the trade show. And we need a plan to make sure that any exports like that occur are authorized, that there is authorization for that information to be transported to that country, that hardware to be transported to that country, and then information to be conveyed to any foreign persons in that country. So how do we authorize all these activities at trade shows? What do the ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, which I know you've all heard about in prior presentations in this series, what do they allow? How do you get to do this stuff? So if we are in the land of the ITAR, there's one set of authorizations. If we're in the land of the EAR, it's a different set. You always have to know which world you're in. Sometimes you may be taking hardware subject to the ITAR and hardware subject to the EAR. You may have a laptop that is full of ITAR and EAR data. So what can you do? How can you go to a trade show and conduct your activities without violating the ITAR or the EAR? There are a lot of different options, but these are the primary ones for the ITAR. So under the ITAR, there is an exemption, which isn't really an exemption. The word exemption is very confusing. Exemption just means a type of authorization, a type of license that is published in advance. It's published in the regulation. You can use it as long as you satisfy all the conditions that are laid out in the regulation. It's not an exclusion. It doesn't mean that the activity is not regulated. It's not exempt. It's only exempt from the requirement to apply for a license and wait for the government to respond. But it is itself a type of authorization, a type of license, and it comes with strings attached. You have to be able to satisfy the conditions. So what are the conditions? For the trade show exemption, there is a specific exemption in the ITAR for trade shows. It's in part 123.16b5 of the ITAR. And the strings that are attached to using this are that it is only for unclassified hardware. By unclassified, I don't mean that it doesn't have an export classification. I mean, it's not subject to government secrecy regulations. Okay, James Bond classification. It means that the government has not decided that it should be considered top secret or compartmentalized or something like that, okay? So it can't be classified. If it is, you can't use the exemption. No taking that to trade shows without a license from DDTC. It must be hardware. this exemption does not cover any information that you might want to share about the hardware. And so you will need separate authorization for any demonstrations that might reveal technical information about the product, and for defense services associated with an ITAR, piece of ITAR hardware. So this exemption will only cover you putting the hardware in a box and taking it to the trade show location. In addition to not covering classified, government secrecy classified hardware, this exemption does not apply if the hardware is subject to a missile technology control or if it is significant military equipment, SME. And you know that in the ITAR, when you're in the USML, when you look at a piece of hardware, the description of that piece of hardware, if it has an asterisk next to it in the USML, then it's SME, significant military equipment. If it's missile technology controlled, it will have an MT written there. If you've got that kind of hardware, you can't use the exemption. You can only use this exemption in order to display something at a public exhibition, a trade show, or an air show. This is not for private demonstrations to particular potential customers, only for trade shows. Now, in order to use this exemption, you have to already have obtained a license, a DSP 73 or a DSP 5 from the government, from the DDTC, the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, that allows you to take the same hardware to another trade show event. So let's say 2 years before, you wanted to go to a trade show in Germany, you applied to DDTC, they gave you a license to take the same hardware to the trade show in Germany. Well, after you've received that license, and while it is still valid, so within the 4-year validity period of that license, you can then use the exemption to take the same hardware to a different country for a different trade show. Doesn't have to be to the same country as was originally authorized on the license, so it doesn't duplicate the license. You still have the license is still valid for the original request, but now you can use the exemption to sort of expand the scope of that license, if you like, to use the same hardware in different countries. But there has to be an existing and still valid license for that hardware to go to an event in another country. It's a little bit strange condition, but that is how it works. Now, that other license must still be valid, meaning it must be within the 4-year period that ITAR licenses live, and it must not have expired for any other reason. You didn't use up all the quantity or all of the value. It also has to be exactly the same hardware. So if you have a new model of hardware that is being created since the license was issued, you wouldn't be able to use the exemption. Now, like many ITAR exemptions, you cannot use this to travel to any country that is subject to an arms embargo. We refer to those as 126.1 countries because they are listed in Part 126.1 of the ITAR. That just means that they are subject to an arms embargo. And we'll take a look at the list of those countries in a little while. But the exemption does not allow you to go to trade shows in those countries with ITAR items. You could try to get a license, but it's very unlikely that it would be granted. So arms embargoed countries generally off the table. In order to use the license, when you use this ITAR exemption, you have to file electronic export information at the time that you take the hardware out of the United States. And you also have to certify to CBP that you are using the exemption and that you are complying with the conditions of the exemption. And that's all done electronically in the automated export system, ACE, provided by CBP. All right, so that is the trade show exemption. Kind of narrow in its application, but useful. But don't forget, you have to first get a license. And then once you've got that license for one country, Germany, France, UK, Brazil, wherever it might be, you can then, during the period of that license, take the same hardware to other trade shows in other countries. There's an additional exemption, i.e. a license that is pre-published, that applies to models and mock-ups. And this could be useful for trade shows too. And if you have something that is a model of a piece of hardware that you want to take with you to the trade show, and it is inoperable, it doesn't function, and it doesn't contain any ITAR components. So it's a hollow model, for example. It doesn't have any of the ITAR controlled hardware inside it. Then you can use this exemption to take that with you to display at the trade show. The model itself mustn't reveal any technical data that isn't covered by another ITAR exemption. The model and mock-up exemption itself only applies to hardware. And again, you can't use it for trade shows in any arms embargoed country, and you can't use it for items that would be subject to missile technology or SME controls. And again, you have to file electronic export information if you are using it from the United States, and you have to make a certification to Customs and Border Patrol at the time that you use the exemption. With all exemptions, you need to keep records internally, recording what you used the exemption for, where you were going, what you were taking, a full list, and you have to keep those records for at least 5 years after you use the exemption. Now, if you are not able to use the exemption, then your option is to apply for a license to allow you to take the hardware or indeed to perform a demonstration or something that will convey technical data at the trade show. For the hardware, you can apply for a temporary export license. Hard exports of technical data and defense services are never temporary. They're always permanent. Once you say something, you can't take it back. It's in the person who heard its brain forever. And so you can never use a temporary export license for that. But for hardware going to a trade show, a temporary export license, a DSP 73, is the typical thing to get. It allows you to take it out and then bring it back in. As you know, if you're taking it to a trade show, presumably you will bring it back, and so temporary makes sense. It can only stay overseas for 4 years. There is no transfer of title that can occur. You can't sell it to somebody else. If you've got a DSP 73, it has to come back. It has to stay in your possession, and it has to come back to the US. Like all ITAR licenses, they are limited to the particular item that you ask for permission to export, and a particular quantity and value of items. And when you've used up the quantity and value, the license is no longer valid. So you have to keep track of how many items you take under the license and what the value is, and deduct it from the total value of the license. Sometimes you will ask for a pizza and be given a hamburger, or vice versa. That means that the US government imposes conditions on the license that change the scope. Maybe you wanted to take certain items that perform in a particular wavelength. And DGTC says, well, you can take items, but only in this wavelength, which is half the wavelength that you asked for. That's what I mean by asking for a pizza and getting a hamburger. So you have to pay careful attention to any provisos on the license. And you need to build in time. You cannot get a license like that, unfortunately. And so you need to plan ahead. If you're going to a trade show, you're going to take hardware with you, you need to give it plenty of time, several months, in order to be sure that you will get that license back in time for you to leave. All of the same kinds of observations apply to getting a permanent export license. This is what you would need for the technical data if you're planning to share any information that would be technical in nature at the trade show, or if you're planning to do a demonstration that would constitute assistance to a foreign person in the operation or use of the defense article. That would be a defense service. You must have a DSP-5 for that. And very often we refer to these, for this type of activity, DGTC thinks of them as marketing licenses. And you would apply for a marketing license in order to provide the technical data or to do a demo that would constitute defense services. Again, they're only valid for 4 years, and you have to keep track of exactly the scope of activity that was authorized and make sure you stay within those lines. All right, so those are the kind of ITAR authorization options for trade shows, for the intended trade show activities of taking hardware, displaying the hardware, and perhaps providing a little demonstration of how the hardware works. But you must have authorization. And for the demonstrations, there is only one option. The exemptions won't do it. You must have a DSP-5 for that aspect. Okay. As I mentioned, you cannot use the exemptions for arms embargoed countries. That's the point over here on the right-hand side. And this is a list of the current arms embargoed countries. So no trade shows in these countries, or at least you would not be able to participate in those trade shows to the extent that the hardware that you want to demonstrate is ITAR controlled. There is some good news, which is that basic marketing information, where that is defined as meaning very high-level system descriptions. You know, it's an item that can perform at this level and that does this thing, but very, very high level, no information that you would be unhappy with your competitors receiving, no intellectual property, just a very general system description. That is not subject to the ITAR or the EAR. It's not subject to export regulations. And so you can take that and you don't need authorization. But sometimes people who are preparing marketing brochures get a little excited, a little carried away. They start putting in photographs from the shop floor, showing people, you know, actively assembling the item. Now you would be outside of the scope of a general system description. That photograph in the marketing brochure might well be technical data, information required for the assembly of the item or the repair of the item. And so it's very important before you take a bunch of marketing brochures and head off on the airplane to the trade show, that somebody in export compliance reviews them and confirms that those marketing brochures don't contain any ITAR or EAR controlled data. And it's prudent to stamp those documents with the statement does not contain any information subject to the ITAR or the EAR or words to that effect, so that everybody is sure that that information, when it's distributed, was not subject to regulation and didn't require any authorization. So I've seen things go wrong with that. You definitely want to make sure before you leave that your marketing materials are clean and not subject to the regulation. Defense services, I mentioned, those can occur even if you don't transmit any technical data. So if you are demonstrating an ITAR controlled product, the question to ask is whether that demonstration provides assistance to the people watching, the foreign persons of the trade show, in any of the design or development or engineering or manufacture or production, etc., or operation or use. Those are the two most common ways for a defense service to occur at a trade show. You're demonstrating the item, you're showing somebody how to operate it or use it. That constitutes a defense service, even if no technical information is conveyed. And that requires a DSP-5, a permanent export license. So you've got to think about that before you head off. All right, so those are the ITAR authorizations and the ITAR wrinkles, the things that can go wrong. Now, well, let's talk about the EAR. Okay, what can we do under the EAR? Same challenges. You're taking hardware subject to the EAR, it needs to be authorized. You want to display or demonstrate the product, you need authorization for that. You want to take information that goes beyond pure marketing, pure high-level system descriptions, then you're going to need EAR authorization. So what can you do? Well, under the EAR, things are sometimes less complicated than under the ITAR. There are situations where you can export no license required, NLR. Now, oddly enough, NLR is a type of authorization. It's not really export control free. It doesn't mean you can do anything you like. It means that you don't need to apply for a license or use a license exception for that particular activity, and you have confirmed that there are no restrictions on the activity. Now, if an item is subject to the EAR and it is classified as EAR 99, then very often you will be able to export that no license required. But you do need to make sure that you're not going to an embargoed country or to Belarus or Russia. And you would need to make sure that you are not organizing the trade show with or collaborating with parties that are subject to export restrictions, like the entity list, denied parties. They can't even be your freight forwarder, they can't be involved at all. And of course, you always have to think about economic sanctions. So EAR 99 is not export control free, but in most cases, if you're going to a trade show in Germany and you've checked all the parties and nobody is subject to any restrictions, you will be able to use no license required to take that EAR 99 item with you. You can also use no license required for hardware that is on the Commerce Control List, that is, it has an ECCN, but it doesn't require a license for the destination country. Let's say you're going to Brazil, you check the Commerce country chart, and it tells you, and the reason for control for the ECCN, and it tells you that you don't need a license for that country. After you look at the chart, you have to check some other things which can trigger license requirements, like special controls for certain countries, Cuba, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Russia, Iraq, certain parts of Ukraine can trigger special controls. Assuming you're not going to any of those, then you can probably take the item As long as the Commerce Country Chart doesn't say you need a license, you can take it, no license required, to the trade show. You may need to file electronic export information if the hardware that you're transporting exceeds a certain value, $2,500, or if you do need a license, then you would need to file EEI. Now, even if the hardware is no license required to the location of the trade show, it can happen that the corresponding technology information about how the item operates, how it's produced, information that is required for the design, development, production, etc., or use sometimes of the hardware, that technology might require a license to some of the countries of the participants at the trade show. You're going to France, but that doesn't mean that everybody at the trade show in France will be French. There could be people there from other countries, and the analysis about them receiving the technology could be different. So it is important to consider carefully and really only take information or convey information that would be exportable to a broad range of countries without a license. You don't want to take something that would need a license unless you apply for a license, but it's impossible to anticipate all of the countries, so it would be very difficult to get a license to cover every possible country at a trade show. And of course, ITAR controlled items can never be exported, no license required. Now, what if you need to take something that is on the Commerce Control List and that does indeed require a license for the destination country where the trade show is going to be held? It is possible to use license exception TMP for temporary. This is sort of the equivalent of the ITAR trade show exemption, if you like. It allows you to take commodities and software that would require a license to the destination, but not technology. Okay, it only covers the hardware and software if for some reason you're taking software. It only has a life of 1 year. So unlike a DSP 73, an ITAR temporary export license, if you're using TMP, you only get 1 year to take your EAR items to the trade show. And you can only exhibit at one trade show for up to 120 days. After that, you've got to go somewhere else. You can't stay there exhibiting forever at that trade show. And when you demonstrate the items, or when you are using the items, you can only use those items at the trade show for the minimum necessary for effective demonstration. So you have to think carefully about how you're displaying them and how you're demonstrating them, and make sure that it doesn't go past that minimum level of effective demonstration. Unsurprisingly, you can't use this license exception if you are going to an embargoed destinations. That would be Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. For OFAC reasons, it would also include parts of Ukraine, Crimea, the Donetsk People's Republic, and the Luhansk People's Republic. And certain ECCNs, you can't use license exception TMP for certain ECCNs to certain destinations. For example, 600 series items in a D5, an arms embargoed country, you wouldn't be able to use TMP. So you have to check the requirements very carefully to make sure that you are able to use TMP. You've got to keep control of the item at the trade show. So you have to be able to demonstrate that that item did not become subject to any foreign party's control while you were there. You're going to need to keep a log. You're going to need to have some way of showing that you secured the items at the trade show appropriately. You didn't just leave them lying around when you went back to the hotel in the evenings, those kinds of things. And when you export the item, the electronic export information needs to reflect that the party exporting it, your company, will be the recipient, the ultimate consignee, the party that will receive the item in the foreign country. Those are all requirements to use license exception TMP. And you, again, need to have a record showing that you complied with all of those requirements, exactly what you sent, exactly who took it, how long for, when it leaves, and then when it comes back, showing that it came back within a year, that everything that went out came back, nothing got lost. If things do get lost, then you are going to need to consult with your export compliance professionals about a potential disclosure to BIS, for example. All right. Now, there are some other license exceptions. I'm not going to talk about those in great detail, but for example, there is something called limited value shipments that allows you to take items that are below a certain threshold, but you can only use LVS if, when you look at the ECCN and the CCL, it says LVS and then a dollar value. That tells you that LVS is available, and it tells you the value of the items that can be exported. These are typically pretty low. There's some are 500, some are 2,500. I think there are a few that are 5,000. So it doesn't really work for expensive equipment. There is an annual value limit. So if you keep using LVS, at some point you're going to run into a threshold and you'll have to stop using it. And you can only use it for certain countries. Country group B is countries. You look in the EAR, there's a list of country groups. Country group B is pretty big. It includes a lot of different destinations, but not all countries are on it. And there are restrictions on which items you can and can't take. There's also a GBS, license exception, country group B, which allows you to take a lot of things to country group B countries. But again, the ECCN has to specifically authorize use of this particular license exception. If you're using any license exception, you have to file electronic export information at the time of the export. For technology and software, TSU is the option. Again, TMP does not cover technology, only commodities and software. LVS and GBS similarly cover commodities, but not technology. So if you are going to take technology, something that is not just high-level systems description and therefore is not exempt, then TSU allows you to take operation technology, but only the minimum necessary, and sales technology, the type of information you would typically transmit with a quotation, bid, or offer, as long as it does not disclose any design, production, or manufacturing information. And again, if you're using a license exception, you must file electronic export information and keep records for 5 years. If you can't use a license exception in order to take what you want with you to the trade show or to provide the demonstration that you want to provide, then you can apply for an EAR export license. Those will be valid for 4 years. They're only valid for exactly the place that you say you want to go and for the activity that you describe in the license application and for the particular items that you include in the application, the freight forwarder that you name in the application, the number of items, the value of items, all of that has to be laid out, and then you have to stay inside those limitations. Now, an export license is a little bit like a driver's license that tells you you can drive between the hours of 6 and 9 a.m. on Tuesdays, and you can only turn left. They are very, very specific. You have to keep track of all of that when you use it, and you have to file electronic export information at the time of the export. Now, again, as for the ITAR, if you're applying for an EAR license, typically takes some time to get that back. So you need to plan ahead. You're going to want to leave a couple of months in order to first prepare the export license and then submit it and then wait to hear back from the Department of Commerce. And depending on how many countries you're asking for, which items you're exporting, it might take longer or shorter. The fewer items you ask for and the fewer countries, the quicker it will go, unless one of the countries is particularly problematic for some reason. All right, so I'm not seeing any questions about any of this so far. Now, that was all about the activities that you intend to perform at the trade show. But as I mentioned, sometimes there are other things that happen in connection with traveling to the trade show, particularly carrying technical data on electronic devices and logging into your work environment from a foreign country. And you must think about those activities too and make sure that they are authorized for the people who are going to the trade show. A, that they're aware that these are requirements, and B, that somebody in export compliance has educated them on how to do those activities in a compliant manner. Now, under both the ITAR and the EAR, if what you need to do is take an electronic device that contains ITAR or EAR controlled data to a foreign country, if that device is encrypted end-to-end to an appropriate standard, AES 128, and in accordance with the sort of requirements laid out and the standards laid out in FIPS 140-2, then you would be able to take the laptop and it wouldn't constitute an export of all of the data on the laptop to that country. But that doesn't work if you're planning to travel to a 126.1 country, an arms embargoed country under the ITAR, or a D5 country, also arms embargoed countries under the EAR. But if you're going to a European country or Brazil or some other place that we have good relations with that is not subject to an arms embargo, then taking the laptop or the other encrypted device might take care of the problem of taking the information with you. But as a best practice, most companies will not allow people to travel with such devices because things can happen. And the device can get lost, the encryption can break, problems can arise. And so it is safer to travel with a clean electronic device and to have an out-of-office message that notifies people you will be traveling and tells them not to send you any technical data while you are traveling. The alternative to the encryption carve-out is something called the personal use exemption or exception. There is one in the ITAR and one in the EAR. They both work in a similar way. They allow you to take with you ITAR or EAR controlled data as long as you have procedures in place to prevent any unauthorized foreign person access. And you have to protect the item that you're taking with you. It is only valid for a temporary trip abroad, not for permanent use in that country. And the only people that can use it are individuals who are either employed by the US government or directly employed by a US person and not by a foreign subsidiary of a US person. If a foreign person is going to use this exemption, they have to be authorized for all of the data that they're taking with them, of course. And you can't use it again for problematic countries, ITAR 126.1 countries, and comprehensively embargoed countries. There are strings attached to these, but the most important thing for these exemptions and exceptions is that you are protecting it from unauthorized access. And again, as a best practice, many companies these days will say, we don't want to use the temporary personal use exemption or the encryption carve-out. We're just not going to let anyone travel with ITAR or EAR controlled data on their laptops because that way is safest in case something goes wrong. All right, so that's on the incidental export side. Now, I see that there are no particular questions so far, so I'm going to move on to some other trade show related export control risks. Other things that can happen at trade shows that could lead to an ITAR or EAR violation. So ITAR brokering. And I'm not sure if this has come up so far in your discussions of the ITAR and the EAR this week, but the ITAR requires authorization for brokering activities by US persons and by persons who are located in the United States. A brokering activity is any activity on behalf of somebody else, on behalf of a third party, to facilitate manufacture, export, permanent import, transfer, etc., of a US or foreign defense article. And that can include soliciting sales of defense articles. So obviously, when you go to a trade show, the whole purpose is to solicit sales of the items. Now, it doesn't include activities by a regular employee. So if I'm a US company and I send my permanent and regular employee to a trade show to promote sales of my items to foreign parties, because they're my employee, their activity is not on behalf of another, and that does not constitute brokering. But if the person I send to the trade show is a contractor or a consultant, not a permanent and regular employee, as that term is defined, then when they are promoting the sale of my product to foreign persons, that could be ITAR brokering, and that may need to be authorized ahead of time. Similarly, if I am going to a trade show and when I'm there, I'm not only promoting my company's products, but I am cross-promoting another product that is used with my company's product, like an IR camera that is made by another party and that is installed on my unmanned aerial system. I'm promoting my unmanned aerial system, but I'm simultaneously promoting my partner company's infrared camera. And explaining why they're a good fit or something together and why we recommend that particular IR camera for customers who want our UAS system with IR capabilities. Well, then I'm promoting another company's goods, and that would constitute brokering and might require authorization. So that is something to watch out for. What do you need to think about when the person who's going to the trade show is not a permanent and regular employee, or when there might be cross-promotion of a third party's products that are used with your product? Okay. Brokering. So that's one thing to think about on top of the normal export activities. It's always important to bear in mind economic sanctions whenever you are going to a trade show and interacting with parties at the trade show. Economic sanctions are much broader than US export controls. They prohibit any kind of dealing with parties or countries that are subject to US economic sanctions. And it doesn't matter whether the product is EAR 99, it doesn't matter whether the information that is being distributed is free, that there's no money being exchanged. So you have to really be careful with economic sanctions. Now, sometimes the information that you would distribute would be informational materials, and those are exempt. What does informational materials mean? It means information that was created for general use, and before the interaction, and wasn't customized for the sanctions targets. So standard marketing brochures would typically fall into that bucket. So you don't have to worry about handing out standard marketing brochures and making sure that the party you're handing it to is not from an embargoed countries or on a sanctions list. But you do have to be careful about certain other things that can occur at trade shows. So obviously you need to, before you leave, screen any parties that you know you're going to meet with and make sure they are not subject to sanctions or otherwise do business with. So that could be the host of the trade show, the service providers of the trade show, the forwarding agents, etc. When you're actually at the trade show, you can't possibly check every person who comes along to talk to you or to attend an open demonstration. And so to avoid having a sanctions violation, you're going to want to restrict the information that you distribute or that you provide in the context of the demonstration to general systems information, marketing materials that would be available to any prospective customer, not customized for a particular market or a particular party. And if the salespeople at the trade show decide that there's a good prospect and they want to have a more in-depth discussion, maybe they decide they're going to take somebody out to dinner, maybe they're going to go and have a drink, maybe they're going to step to the side of the trade show and have a more in-depth meeting about their products and the customer's interest. At that point, you are entering the zone where it is important to make sure that the parties are not subject to sanctions. So at that point, the business folks would need to say, okay, before I schedule this dinner, before we step aside to have a more in-depth discussion, I need to know who I'm dealing with. What country are they from? Are they on any sanctions lists, etc.? So at that point, screening needs to occur. And the folks who are going to the trade show need to have their wits about them and be aware of red flags. You know, if it's clear, if people at the trade show have a badge that shows which country they're from, if they're from a sanctioned country, then the trade show folks need to know not to engage in any substantive discussions with those folks. And afterwards, if there are prospects emerging from the trade show, those need to be taken back and screened so that you don't waste time following up with parties and violate sanctions, following up with parties who are subject to sanctions. So that's brokering and sanctions. What else might we need to worry about when we're going to a trade show? Unfortunately, it's quite a long list. There can be issues with anti-boycott laws. So the US government does not approve of certain foreign boycotts, including the Arab League boycott of Israel. And the US government therefore doesn't want US companies to participate in any way or support or facilitate those boycotts in any way. Now, when you go to a trade show in an officially boycotting country, and that would include Iraq, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Yemen at this particular point in time, then there may be documents that you have to sign as a condition of participating in the trade show. There may be contracts, and those could include clauses that violate the anti-boycott laws. These are very complicated regulations. I'm not going to try and give you a summary right now. The important thing to realize is that if you're heading to a trade show in one of those countries, then somebody needs to be very carefully scrutinizing the language of the contracts and other documents that you're filling out to make sure you don't inadvertently step on an anti-boycott landmine. Those issues can also come up with countries that are not officially boycotting Israel, but that do tend to have practices that discriminate against Israeli companies. And those include Singapore, Malaysia, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Those can all raise potential issues. And similarly, if after the trade show you are engaged in you get lucky and customers from those countries want to buy lots of your product. That's great, congratulations. But before you break out the champagne, somebody's got to make sure that during contract negotiations and in sales documents, RFQs, etc., there aren't any problematic requests under the anti-boycott laws. The activity, the kinds of things that are problematic include any agreements to refuse to do business with Israel or with blacklisted countries. So if they're asking you to make promises that nothing you supply to them will be sourced from any Israeli company, that's going to be a problem. Sometimes the requests are more subtle than that. It can get quite complicated. They're asking you to provide information about the race, religion, sex, or national origin of any person or contractor. That's going to be a problem. So somebody really has to scrutinize very carefully requests from the customers, contracts with the customers, contracts with the trade show organizers if you're going to those countries. There can also be IRS consequences as well as EAR violation issues. So very important to keep an eye on anti-boycott issues. Now, the other thing that comes up when you're going to trade shows is that there are foreign import controls. You don't just have to worry about the US government, somebody also has to worry about the country that you're traveling to. You're taking something into that country, it's crossing the border. There may be restrictions on what you can take into that country. There may also be taxes, duties, customs import duties that have to be paid to take the item into the country. So that all has to be dealt with as well. Now, some countries have some pretty strict import restrictions. Hong Kong, for example, requires an import and then later an export permit for any item on its controlled goods list. And that is a long controlled good list. It's quite similar to the Commerce Control List. So a lot of items are on there. And if you're trying to comply with the EAR simultaneously, then you do have to, if you don't get the Hong Kong permit, you might also be violating the EAR for certain types of items. Singapore similarly has permit requirements for items on its list. The UAE has those requirements too, but it also controls or prohibits the import of items that you might not think of as problematic, like e-cigarettes and red laser pointers. So, that's a little strange, probably to most parties in the US. You could easily have a little laser pointer in your pocket and not be realizing that that's going to be a problem when you travel to the UAE. So you got to consider those kinds of restrictions. How to do that? Well, there are a lot of different countries with a lot of different rules that can be quite challenging. But a very good multinational customs broker, a large customs broker organization, should be able to alert you to many of those concerns. You can also call the US Embassy for that country, or you can call the country's embassy in the United States and ask them. You can go to the State Department website and review country guidance. You can Google to try to find the country's import website and then use Google Translate to see what it actually says if it's not in English. Or you can call a law firm or a consultant. That will be more expensive, but perhaps more efficient than the other options. So it is important to think about that. You definitely don't want to find yourself sitting in jail in a foreign country because you inadvertently took something in that wasn't allowed and that you didn't have a permit for. That would not be a good situation. On the tax side, taking your US origin item to display in the foreign country, you have to think about whether you need to pay import duties. And very often it will be the case that you're taking something that would provoke an import duty obligation. But there is a solution in many cases, which is to use a carnet. Carnets can be used to expedite temporary imports to a trade show and avoid having to pay customs duties on those items, and then US duties when you bring it back into the United States. They solve both of those problems. They do not replace any export or import permits. Carnets are purely for the question of whether you need to pay a duty. They don't solve the problem of whether you need an import permit to bring it in or an export permit to take it out. It's just purely for the avoidance of paying import duties. There are different kinds of carnets. The ATA carnets are accepted in the majority of countries, about 80, a few more than 80, maybe 87 at this point. Taiwan, if you're going to Taiwan, you have to use a different kind of carnet. They only accept the TECRO AIT carnets. To use a carnet, there's usually a fee you have to pay, and the cost varies depending on what you want to take and which countries you want to take it to. You usually have to follow a particular process for presenting it to customs on entry and exit, which means the folks who are transporting the goods to the trade show need to know how to do that. It's easier if you use a freight forwarder and nobody takes anything hand carry, because then nobody has to deal with this except the freight forwarder, and usually they know what they're doing. But if somebody plans to hand carry something to a trade show, then they need to know how to present the carnet. They're usually only valid for a year, but if it's for an exhibition or a fair, it'll be less. It'll only be 6 months. Typically, they can't be extended, so you've got to do some planning. If you're going to go from one to another, then your carnet may run out pretty quickly. And you have to list the items that you're taking, and you have to be able to show that the same items went out and came back in. It won't cover swag and giveaways. It only covers non-consumables. So if you're taking a bunch of swag and giveaways, you may have to pay duties on that, and you can't get out of it by using a carnet. And there are some country-specific limitations. So again, you're going to need guidance on that point. All right, so putting this all together, and then I'll take a look at the questions and see what folks have asked. This is kind of a guide for all the things that you need to think about. There may be others, but this hits on the big ones. So before you go to a trade show, you need to involve a compliance specialist, someone within your organization who has done this before, and you want to do that early. This is not going to work if you decide you're going to the trade show in 3 days' time. It's going to be a big scramble, and probably you won't be able to do it in a compliant manner. So you want to plan ahead, several months before you go to the trade show at least, and identify everything that's going to be taken, all the hardware, any software, and any information that you're taking, including marketing materials. Just because they're marketing materials, again, doesn't mean that they are necessarily export-free. You've got to check and make sure that nobody got overexcited and put some sensitive photograph into the marketing materials. So you want to gather up everything that's going to be taken and have export compliance within your organization review it. Determine the export classifications for all of those items. If there are documents that are not subject to the regulation because they only contain high-level system descriptions, you want to clearly mark them as not subject to the regulation so that there is no ambiguity, nobody gets confused, nobody panics later. For each item that is subject to the regulations, and certainly all hardware, you need to know how you're going to export it. Can I use no license required? Do I need to use the ITAR exemption for trade shows? Can I use the EAR TMP, or do I need to go and get an EAR license or a DSP 73 for the ITAR? What am I going to do to authorize taking this item to the trade show or sharing this information at the trade show? If you're using licenses or exemptions or exceptions, then you have got to document the fact that you complied with the conditions, keep a record of exactly what you took, exactly where it went, get proof that it came back with you. This has all got to be carefully recorded, which means you're going to need some checklists and some procedures for checking off what you need on the way out and then checking it all back in on the way back. Got to keep all of that for at least 5 years after the exemption or license. If you're using an exemption, it's just 5 years. If you use a license, you have to keep it for 5 years after the license expires. Licenses are typically valid for 4 years, so that results in a 9-year record keeping period. Okay, you got to know who's going and train them on what they can and can't do, including alerting them to brokering issues, including alerting them to economic sanctions issues, making sure they don't engage in sharing technical information that isn't authorized on the side in follow-up meetings, etc. And then make sure that all of the paperwork is in order. While the folks are at the show, you want to make sure that they are maintaining control of the export-controlled devices and any electronic devices they took with them, that they are avoiding technical discussions and following any guidance that they were given on limitations in licenses or license exceptions. Keeping an eye on the 120-day clock. Remember, if you're using TMP under the EAR, you can only stay in one place for 120 days. Then you've got to move on to the next trade show, and so on. Okay, you also need to be sure that if opportunities arise at the trade show to get a little closer with a prospective client, take them out to dinner, maybe actually move forward with sales planning activity. That needs to be, you need to stop before you do that. The folks at the trade show need to understand that the potential customer needs to be screened, need to make sure they're not from an embargoed country, not on a restricted list, et cetera, et cetera. And then when the trade show is over and everything comes back, somebody has to check them in, make sure they all came back, make sure that there are proper records have been produced and are being kept. If there are leads from the trade show, make sure that those folks are not subject to any sanctions or export control restrictions. And if something went wrong, if you lost something at the trade show, or if there was a conversation that shouldn't have occurred with a customer that is restricted in some way, then those need to be reported to export compliance so they can investigate and determine whether it would be good for the company to do a voluntary disclosure to the government or whether that might not be necessary. So that's a little list that will hopefully help you develop appropriate procedures for making sure that the trade show complies with the many and various restrictions imposed by US law. And with that, I'm going to wrap up the presentation and we will consider any questions. So I'm taking a look at the list here in the Q&A. Let's see, if you're alone in a hotel room and use a laptop with a firewall and VPN to access your email or remote server, would that still be considered an export? Well, this is a little fact specific, a little bit complicated. If you have end-to-end encryption between your location and your company, and you're the only you are part of the organization that is providing the data. So you are a full-time and regular employee of that organization, and you're the only one,